I was here several years ago, and it's wonderful to be back, to be invited back, and to see this institution continue to thrive. We were talking at breakfast this morning, and I think you all were sort of on the cutting edge by naming your university, like placing it under the patronage of Newman. It's fascinating for how influential he's been. You don't see a lot of schools bearing that name, so I think it was kind of strategic. I don't know like how much strategy went into it at the time, but kudos on being ahead of the curve on that one. So we're gathering here today partly in honor of Newman being named a doctor of the church, which took place on All Saints' Day of this last year, 2025. This further elevated Newman's profile as one of the greatest thinkers in church history. Now, one does not become a doctor of the church without exemplary holiness. That's a prerequisite of the title, and it's what I touched on last night. But this honorific doctor of the church is also an affirmation of the saints' intellectual contributions. And that's what I'd like to focus on today, with this being a university community. It's great having students here, and certainly professors, to look at that part of Newman's legacy. We live and work in disorienting times. With the increasing secularization of our culture, many students come to our schools without a sound philosophical or theological foundation. Not sure if there's any science professors in the room, but the biological and natural sciences are often pursued within a purely materialistic framework, and higher education, especially at state schools, is oriented towards utilitarian ends, with the emphasis being primarily on job preparation above all else. Newman, our most recent doctor of the church, anticipated many of these issues that we face today. When he considered the direction of society, he warned others that Christianity has never yet had the experience of a world that is simply irreligious. So if you think about it, the ancient world, ancient societies believed in gods, plural, and developed various rituals to placate them. What Newman called the infidelity of the future would be of a kind that Christians had never encountered. So we had gone from Christendom, a society permeated by religious convictions, and now going to a world that was simply irreligious. Newman said the trials which lie before us are so great that they would appall and make dizzy even such courageous hearts as St. Athanasius, Gregory the Great, or Gregory the Seventh. So St. Newman was wide-eyed about the problems that Christianity was staring down. He was never a theologian that buried his head in the sand. This afternoon, I'd like us to consider the nature of Newman's response as much as the content of what he had to say. So in what follows, I'm going to talk about three big issues that Newman faced. And I guess as you're sitting there, whatever perspective or discipline you might be coming from, don't worry so much about the conclusions that Newman draws. We could have debates and discussion about those. But I think what's instructive for us is the stance that Newman took. He did not retreat from the philosophical conversations of his time. He did not construct a kind of bulwark against the cultured despisers of Christianity. Much to the contrary, Newman was actively involved in all sorts of debates, from the organization of schools to the nature of conscience, and so on. In this respect, and I have learned we've got some Thomas in the room, Newman placed himself in a long line of impressive Christian thinkers, such as St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who sought to explain the faith in dialogue with the philosophical and scientific learning of the day. So I think you'll sometimes see a mistake in today's world and at Catholic institutions, where the idea becomes we have to sort of ape what St. Thomas or John Henry Newman had to say. That wasn't really the program for either one of them. They were both fully conversant with the philosophical and scientific streams of their time, and they sought to develop their own ideas in conversation with those. So for our purposes, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on three significant contributions that Newman made as a thinker. Namely, his philosophy of history, so that'll be our first part of the talk, his defense of the reasonableness of faith, and his vision for university education. So I hope at the end here to sort of cast a vision about the work that you all are doing here at Newman University. So first, Newman's understanding of history. I touched on this last night. Newman's lifespan from 1801 to 1890 and he converted from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism in 1845. At the time of Newman's conversion, Roman Catholicism and really most major Christian traditions were committed to a successionist understanding of church doctrine, meaning very briefly that doctrine was conceived sort of as propositions given by Christ to the apostles and then had been passed down in sort of pristine form from that time until our own day. Semper Eadem was the rallying cry. The church and its teaching had always remained the same. So that was the Catholic perspective, and like his Catholic counterparts, Newman inherited a disdain for innovation. At the time, one of the worst sort of insults you could give a theologian was that he was too innovative. Anglicans considered themselves as faithful to antiquity. The Christian religion, they said, came from Christ in a complete and perfect form, and the church had immutably maintained the deposit of faith. When Newman first felt the gravitational pull of Catholicism, so in the early 1840s, he had to wrestle anew with these questions. Already in the 1830s, Newman was critical of Protestantism. So as an Anglican, he considered himself sort of small c Catholic, and when he looked at the Protestant reformers, he said they made a mistake by cutting themselves off from tradition. This idea of sola scriptura, the Bible alone as authority, left out key parts of the faith. Prior to his conversion, though, Newman did not think that the antidote was Roman Catholicism. Far from it, if Protestantism had gone astray by cutting itself off from tradition, Catholics had made the opposite error, uncritically accepting what he called corruption. So the way that I think about this, I stole this from one of my professors, but when Catholics look at the Protestant world, they sort of see like Soldier Field with an empty table in the middle. It's sort of an empty space, it's missing key things. When Protestants looked at the Catholic world, and this is sort of how Newman viewed Catholicism, it's kind of like a cluttered attic. There were things added that were unnecessary. Newman's guiding principle was a claim from Vincent of Lorraine that we must only hold as apostolic or as doctrine that which has been believed always, everywhere, and by everyone. Once Newman became convinced of the errors of Anglicanism, though, he had to reassess his outlook. And the fruit of Newman's struggling with these questions is an 1845 book called An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. And this is still widely considered at least the most influential book on this topic, if not the most convincing. I know recently some criticisms have been raised, but certainly a seminal essay on this topic. In his essay, Newman nuances his earlier position. His emphasis in the book is on resemblance. Recognizing the true church, he said, is like recognizing the face of an acquaintance after not seeing that person for many years. So you have a friend during your undergraduate days, you see her when she's 62, and you still know that's Susan, even though she's changed in dramatic ways. As Newman surveyed the landscape of his time, he said that the Catholic Church of today most closely resembles the ancient church of the first few centuries. So Newman says, did St. Athanasius or St. Ambrose suddenly come to life, it cannot be doubted what communion they would mistake for their own. Remember, he's writing in England. Were the two saints to travel until they reached another fair city, seated among groves, green meadows, and calm streams, the holy brothers would turn from many a high aisle and solemn cloister which they found there, and ask their way to some small chapel where Mass was said in the populous alley or the forlorn suburb. So for Newman, as he thinks about St. Athanasius coming back to life, he wouldn't be deterred from the solemnity of the chapels necessarily. He would recognize in Catholic worship the worship that he had been handed down. After setting forth this hypothetical, Newman then elaborates on some of the resemblances between the early church and the Catholic Church of today. So here's where he sees resemblances. Christianity was accused of being superstitious in ancient times. The Roman Catholic Church, but not Protestant communities, is accused of superstition now. The ancient church held poverty in admiration, was hated by the non-Christian as proselytizing, antisocial, revolutionary, intolerant, associated with intrigue, bore the reputation of a secret society, was the natural enemy of non-Christian governments, despised by intellectuals, and spread over the known world. The same could be said of the Catholic Church today. So this idea of resemblance. To reinforce his argument, Newman employs all sorts of metaphors, all of them meant to emphasize the organic development of doctrine. Just as an oak tree is fundamentally the same organism as the acorn from which it grew, authentic doctrinal developments retain the same type and principles as the original revelation. The most memorable description of this process can be found in the first chapter of an essay on development. If you'll pardon a lengthy quotation, this is a really important point, so I'd like to let Newman speak for himself. This passage struck me the first time I read it because I grew up in a Christian tradition in a church that really emphasized that what was pure was the source. You have to go back to the earliest stage of Christianity to find purity. And then what followed was corruption. Newman sort of inverts that idea. So, quote, "It is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring. Whatever use may fairly be made of this image, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or belief, which on the contrary is more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep and broad and full. It necessarily arises out of an existing state of things, and for a time savors of the soil. Its vital elements needs disengaging from what is foreign and temporary. In time, the stream enters upon strange territory. Points of controversy alter their bearing. Parties rise and fall around it. Dangers and hopes appear in new relations, and old principles reappear under new forms." Now listen to this next part. "It changes with them in order to remain the same. In a higher world it is otherwise, but here below to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often." A little plug, I published a book called "To Be Perfect is to Have Changed Often." So if you're looking for material to fall asleep to, I can give you the information for that one. Note what Newman says here: ideas develop or change in order to what? In order to remain the same. I'm sure some of the students in the room, you've studied church history a bit. If you think to the early stages of Christological controversies, what do we see happening there? The heretic Arius, there's a priest who he starts to float this idea that the Son of God was the first and greatest of God's creations, but was not fully divine. He even wrote a little tune so you could remember this. There was a time when the Son was not. When the church confronted Arius, he was ready to sign on to any passage of Scripture. There was no part of the Bible that he wouldn't sign on to. It wasn't until the creedal statement of Nicaea that the Son was homoousios, or consubstantial with the Father, that Arius found himself painted into a corner. The use of such language for Christians was new, but the development helped to preserve what the church had always believed. One could go down the line with all sorts of doctrinal statements. The Immaculate Conception, transubstantiation, this language that arises later but captures the essence of the faith that had been handed down. I compare this process, I don't think this is a Newman, I don't know where I picked up on this one, but you can think about church history. If the church is a living organism, if it's the body of Christ, its discernment of doctrine is like an individual sitting in a room at daybreak. And if you ask that person to describe the objects in the room, he could probably, in some ways, describe this, that's a plastic chair, the table is circular. And at first, when he's first in the room, his descriptions would remain broad and sort of vague. As the light in the room increased, his descriptions would become more detailed and specific. But if he's being careful, the language wouldn't contradict each other. The later language would be fuller, but in continuity with what came before. So in saying all this, I just have to be clear, Newman was not advocating for an evolutionary understanding of the faith where doctrines might mutate or go back on themselves. As Avery Cardinal Dulles put it, Cardinal Dulles, shout out, the essay on development is not a brief for a kind of dogmatic Darwinism. Newman's theory has a fundamentally conservative character. This In one of his letters, this has really struck me. So, for example, he noted that St. Paul could hardly have understood what was meant by the Immaculate Conception. If you just walk up to St. Paul and say, "Do you believe in the Immaculate Conception?" What are you talking about? That being said, if he had been asked whether or not Our Lady had the grace of the Spirit, anticipating all sin whatsoever, including Adam's imputed sin, I think, Newman says, he would have answered in the affirmative. The apostles, in other words, would have affirmed later doctrinal statements as long as the terminology of such statements were unpacked for them. The upshot of all this is that Newman helped liberate theologians from an uncritical, ahistorical approach to Christian belief. After Newman, defenders of orthodoxy could no longer resort to simplistic explanations of the transmission of tradition. Now, I may be painting with too broad of strokes here. I already mentioned Vincent of Lorraine, and he talked about development of doctrine. So it's not like this idea was completely new in Christian history, but Newman sort of crystallized it. His aim was to build up, not to tear down. And in working through his own reception of Catholic doctrine, he helped to place the church's understanding of its own past on a firmer foundation. As church historian Eamon Duffy has remarked, Newman was the first great theologian not merely to grasp the importance of the questions posed for faith by the fact of historical flux, but to insist that an acknowledgement of the historical contingency of much of Christian teaching and institutions was firmly compatible with orthodox belief, with the acceptance of dogma. Truth is no lesser the truth because it is a daughter of time. We don't have time this afternoon to follow every one of Newman's conclusions to benefit from his methodology. The path that Newman charted stands as a challenge to all serious students and teachers, especially teachers in the room. Today, Catholic scholars bring aspersions on the faith when we whitewash church history, when we dismiss or ignore recent scientific findings, and when we pretend like doctrines we confess today were delivered all at once, almost as if they descended from heaven, chiseled on stone. I don't have easy answers for every challenge raised against the faith, but I do know that falling back to an entrenched fundamentalism is not the answer, and I'm grateful for places like Newman University who continue to carry forth Newman's spirit. So that's part one, Newman's philosophy of history. That's closely related to the second of his important intellectual contributions, which was his account of the reasonableness of Christian faith. So if you were here last night I touched on the fact that and during Newman's lifetime, that certain theologians, certainly certain influential Catholic thinkers, were resorting to a kind of hyper-papalism, a really heavy emphasis on church authority, and sort of a fideistic conception of truth. Amidst that context, Newman provided a much more nuanced epistemology, one that took seriously the challenges raised by philosophical skepticism without, however, waving the white flag of surrender. So, in Newman's view, modern philosophy suffered from two fundamental defects. First, Newman thought philosophers were mistaken when they approached the pursuit of truth from a standpoint of doubt. Someone like René Descartes. Such a stance, if taken to its logical extreme, could lead us to question everything, even basic first principles. As an alternative, Newman suggested that we have good reason to trust our mental faculties. Since we have been designed by God to know the truth, it doesn't make sense to begin with doubt. So again, this is Newman. There is no medium between using my faculties as I have them and flinging myself upon the external world according to the random impulses of the moment, as spray upon the surface of the waves, and simply forgetting that I am. I am what I am, or I am nothing. Sounds a little bit like Popeye there. I cannot think, reflect, or judge about my being without starting from the very point which I aim at concluding. So in short, Newman, when he looked at thinkers like Descartes or maybe John Locke, he thought that they constructed sort of the human mind as they wanted it to operate instead of as it actually operates. But he thought to really get anywhere in the philosophy of mind, we have to accept fundamental first principles, and those are sort of the foundation. It doesn't make sense to question those. This radical skepticism would be like a snake eating its own tail. Second, Newman parted ways with modern philosophers who asserted that we are only justified in believing something if we possess a formal, logical demonstration of the belief under consideration. So one of his favorite examples of this is that Newman points to the fact that everyone in his country believes that Great Britain is an island. And he says, have we all circumnavigated Great Britain? This is before satellites and airplanes. No, our belief that Great Britain is an island rests on a number of factors, including an implicit trust in the truthfulness of our teachers. And it would be counterproductive, it would be odd to insist upon strict logical proof before we believed assumptions like this to be true. So just to be clear, to cut off an objection at the past, Newman is not calling us to accept uncritically whatever we're taught. Rather, he's simply drawing attention to the fact that there are different modes of rationality appropriate to the diverse truths that comprise human knowledge. From Newman's perspective, it is the same fault to demand demonstration of a historian as to be content with probabilities from a mathematician. Seeking to ground one's faith in the form of logical proof appropriate to the field of mathematics represents a kind of categorical error. In matters of religious conviction, certitude is reached not through syllogistic reasoning, but through an accumulation of probabilities. We deploy this form of reasoning whenever we come to personal knowledge of something that's concrete. So an analogy, I know that's sort of up here a bit. Newman says that strict logical proof, the kind of equations that you would do in trigonometry, he compares that to a branch that you might find in the woods. So if you have to cross a rushing stream, you could place a branch over that stream, and there's something convenient about that. It's efficient. But what happens if you're someone like myself and maybe don't work out enough, right? You're crossing the branch, and if there's too much weight on the center of the branch, it's liable to snap. Newman says in the field of religion that oftentimes the way that we reach conclusions is through an accumulation of probabilities. And so he says another way you could cross the stream is through a wire. But think about a wire. A wire is made up of many different strands. And so when it comes to the faith, that's oftentimes sort of like the proof, scare quotes, that we construct. We listen to our teachers. We're moved by the example of our parents. We see beauty in the celebration of the liturgy. And all of those various factors come together to form a wire by which you can cross the stream. And the great thing about a wire is that maybe one of the strands at different points in your life will weaken or snap, but the wire has a kind of give and take that gives it a malleability, and it's great for crossing that gap. This is how most of us come to the faith. It's not sophisticated philosophical arguments that convince us, but the slow accumulation of various factors. First, we learn from our parents and teachers the basics of the faith. Then maybe our knowledge of the Bible is deepened. We see the example of saints, both living and dead, and encounter the beauty of the faith in the church's liturgy and sacred art. All of these things are threaded together into a robust conviction about the truth of what we believe. So in developing these ideas, Newman provided a defense of the rationality of simple faith. Already in his Oxford University sermons, Newman had signaled his concern about this matter. If children, if the poor, if the busy can have true faith, yet cannot weigh evidence like a philosopher, evidence is not the simple foundation on which faith is built. If you've studied philosophy, you might hear sort of pre-sentiments of thinkers like Bernard Lonergan or Alvin Plantinga in our own day, where Newman says the simple faith of the unlearned is rational, it's warranted, even though it might not have the sophisticated demonstration that you would do in a philosophy class. More could be said on these points, but for the sake of time, let's move to Newman's third significant intellectual contribution, his profound vision for university education. Much has been written about the crisis of the modern university. Clark Kerr, former president of the University of California, said that the modern university could better be described as a multiversity. According to Kerr, the university in its traditional form no longer exist. The university, he wrote, started as a single community made up of masters and students. It may even be said to have had a soul in the sense of an animating principle. Today, however, something entirely different stands in its place. The university as such, this is Kerr, exists in name only. The buildings look the same and the academic titles remain, but the goals and activities of the community, or more accurately, communities, are directed towards radically different, oftentimes competing ends. The large American university of today is, in Kerr's words, an inconsistent institution. Already in the mid-19th century, Newman saw the fracturing of the university taking place, and in his view, this could only be healed by returning to a coherent idea of the nature of a university. So pardon to linguists in the room, Newman may have gotten the etymology a little wrong, or he's playing fast and loose here. But what does a university profess to be? Newman looked at the name, university, and he said, a university by its very name possesses to teach universal knowledge. As such, a university cannot, in principle, exclude any branch of knowledge without doing violence to its very essence. If a university is meant to teach universal knowledge, it cannot excise any field of study. In his own day, Newman was already noticing the trend to cut theology and philosophy from university studies, especially theology, on account of its supposedly non-scientific nature. In Newman's view, such a move is self-defeating. Taking this route does not elevate the university's reputation as a center of learning. Instead, it isolates teachers and students from an entire branch of knowledge, allowing other disciplines to fill the vacuum. So when Newman was tabbed to lead the University of Ireland, this new university in the land of Ireland, he was firmly committed to carving out a place for theology in the curriculum. Theologians, His motivation for doing so was not a matter of self-preservation. Newman wasn't trying to secure future employment. It was rooted in his conviction that religious doctrine truly is knowledge. Thus, if a university intends to be a place of universal learning, as its name implies, it must make space for theological inquiry. So here's Newman. He says that all knowledge forms one whole, and the Creator has so implicated himself with the universe that we cannot truly or fully contemplate it without in some main aspects contemplating God. Those who seek to exclude theology from academic studies are basically suggesting that nothing for certain can be known about the Supreme Being, and Newman thinks that's irrational. So for Newman, the question of theology's place in the curriculum is not incidental, but foundational to a university's identity. This is about the university's very DNA. Any institution claiming to be a university must get right the first principles of academic life, and this task has at its center the question of what constitutes the legitimate range of rational inquiry. If an institution purports to teach all knowledge yet teaches nothing about the Supreme Being, it's an inconsistent institution that's a mystery to its own self. As Newman's argument in the idea of a university unfolds, it becomes evident that his goal is not to carve out a privileged place for theology. Rather, his conviction about theology being essential is rooted in his understanding of the relationship of religious inquiry to other branches of knowledge. So again, Newman sees knowledge as a whole, as a kind of circle of study. Because all knowledge forms one whole, the systematic omission of any one science from the catalog prejudices the accuracy and completeness of our knowledge altogether, and that in proportion to its importance. So Newman thinks if you excise religious inquiry, you'll create a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So what will happen is, in that empty space, other disciplines will rush in to answer questions that theology normally has, but they'll do so poorly. Again, in this respect, he was prophetic. We think about the so-called new atheist, someone like Richard Dawkins. As far as I know, a very respected biologist, a very poor metaphysician. He'd probably fail our intro to philosophy class here. So what happens is we have these vacuums and other disciplines rush in, but they do so poorly. But Newman's critique of modern university education cuts even deeper than this. He was particularly critical of those schools and thinkers who would reduce education to utilitarian ends like securing future employment. The university, in Newman's view, is distinct from a vocational school whose primary purpose is to help students acquire skills necessary to enter a specific trade. Newman has no problem with that sort of idea, but he says the university is about something different. The university is driven by the conviction that knowledge is an end in itself. Like many of us, Newman was repeatedly asked, well, what is the use of a liberal arts education? His reply was short and sweet. Knowledge is its own end, its own reward. Knowledge, he explains, is valuable for what its very presence in us does for us, even if it never issues into any pragmatic outcome. Newman's outlook is even more countercultural today than it was 180 years ago. Today, now I'm probably speaking to some of the administrators in the room, there are all sorts of pressures on us, market forces, parents' expectations, and the like, that tempt us to compromise on this point. We're tempted, I've even heard admissions counselors use this language, to treat education like a widget that someone can purchase and sort of design for themselves. In today's academic landscape, Catholic universities like this one are strategically situated to take up Newman's project, particularly what he has to say about the circle of knowledge, as we can still provide a coherent account of the relationship between philosophy and the rest of the sciences. In addition, we have a mission, God bless missions, for preserving the circle of knowledge as classically understood. While some state-funded institutions may make room for religious studies as a subdiscipline of anthropology, few, if any, will tolerate theology. This will require real sacrifices on the part of Catholic universities. Many parents sending their children to our schools will not readily see the value of theological coursework or the study of classical philosophy. But our dedication to advancing these studies, therefore, must be a principled one, rooted in the firm conviction that our students will go out into the world with a broader range of knowledge than their peers, while also being better prepared to apply their studies in ways that contribute to human flourishing. For this reason and others, Pope Leo XIV rightly declared Newman to be co-patron of Catholic education with his theological forebear, St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's fitting that he now bears this tile. So today I've only been able to paint a preliminary picture of Newman's intellectual legacy. The consistent theme running throughout the three pillars that I've highlighted is the way that Newman struck a golden mean between two opposing extremes. When it came to his study of doctrine, we saw that he charted a course between the Scylla of historical reductionism and the Charybdis of ahistoricism. Christian revelation is not dependent upon historical investigation, as if, as Catholics, we'd have to kind of withhold belief until historians confirmed what we believe to be true. But it's also not just propositions that have dropped from the sky, such that theology would only be repeating the catechism. Doctrine develops for sure, but this development possesses an organic continuity with what preceded it. As Newman intimates at one point, truth is no less the truth for being the daughter of time. He wasn't the first theologian to express this idea, but he provided a particularly compelling explanation of it, and all discussion of development since Newman's time has had to contend with his theory. Similarly, when it comes to our knowledge of the faith, Newman came at the question from a unique angle, and in so doing left us a landmark work that has had incredible staying power. During a time when many other theologians and some bishops were emphasizing authority as a sort of sledgehammer, Newman provided a defense of the reasonableness of faith that took into account how ordinary believers come to know God. Newman, of course, did not set himself against authority. That would have been absurd. But he recognized that if we asked the faithful to accept Catholic teachings solely on the basis of church's authority, that approach would have disastrous consequences, leading to indifference on the part of the educated and superstition on the part of others. Newman was outspoken in his conviction that faith and reason are complementary, not contradictory, acting as two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth, to borrow a phrase from Pope John Paul II. In his defense of the simple faith of the unlearned, Newman was ahead of his time. And in offering this defense, he also challenged the pretensions of elitist skeptics. He chided them subtly but unmistakably for being unwilling to acknowledge their own commitment to first principles that could not be fully proven. And he showed how overvaluing empirical evidence, what is observable as the source of truth, ends up unduly circumscribing the reach of human inquiry. So if we settled on empirical evidence alone, we could never touch the topics of justice, love, and beauty. These ideas laid out in his Grammar of Assent, alongside his urging of the hierarchy to consult the faithful in matters of doctrine, helped push the church towards a stronger respect for the role of laity in preserving the faith. When someone questioned whether it was prudent for the faithful to study theology, Newman pushed back in the following words: "I want a laity not arrogant, not rash in speech, not disputatious, but men who know their religion," today we would say women as well, "who enter into it, who know just where they stand, who know what they hold and what they do not, who know their creed so well that they can give an account of it, who know so much of history that they can defend it." The respected lay apologists and theologians of recent decades owe a debt of gratitude to Newman for helping pave this path. Finally, Newman left us a prophetic vision of university education. When Pope Leo XIV declared Newman a doctor of the church, during his homily, he pointed out that at the heart of the educational project lies a firm conviction in the inherent dignity of each person. There's rumors that our Pope might have an encyclical on artificial intelligence that's in the works, and I think when he talked about Newman and education, that it was those trends that were in the background. So this is a word from the Holy Father. "Life shines brightly not because we are rich, beautiful, or powerful. Instead, it shines when we discover within ourselves the truth that we are called by God. We have a vocation, have a mission, that our lives are something greater than ourselves. Every single creature has a role to play. The contribution that each person can make is uniquely valuable, and the task of educational communities is to encourage and cherish that contribution. Let us not forget," the Pope says, "that at the heart of the educational journey, we do not find abstract individuals, but real people, especially those who seem to be underperforming according to the parameters of economies that exclude or even kill them. We are called to form persons so that they may shine like stars in their full dignity." Close quote. The Pope here powerfully captures a key element of Newman's views on education. For Newman, education could not be reduced to utilitarian ends, and it was not oriented towards making students cogs in the economy. Rather, it is oriented towards helping students identify and live out their vocation, and this can only be accomplished when education retains a healthy respect for the inherent dignity of each person as a creature made in the image of God. As I've observed things here over the last 24 hours, I believe that's what Newman University is about, so I thank you all for the courageous work that you're continuing to undertake here. I think St. John Henry Newman would be proud that this institution bears his name. Thank you.